Our current world is mainly featured by an economic and political system based on the liberalization of market and trade and the non-interventionism. However, the relations between the states and their features have not always been characterized by this approach. In fact, we can set a turning point in history when all started to change, the Bretton Woods. In 1944, just before the end of the Second World War, the Allied powers, under the leadership of Britain and the US, carried out the Bretton Woods Conference in order to establish a basis for the new world economic order. So as to achieve their goal, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, institutions created to promote the liberalization of the economy, were created. Of course, during the negotiations, there were some disagreements between the different countries, especially among the two leading ones, the United States and the United Kingdom. The US delegation, represented by Henry Dexter White, suggested a liberal system based on the dollar and American dominance, while the UK delegation, represented by John Maynard Keynes, proposed a redistributive mechanism in order to correct the uneven development. In the end, the American proposal was more convincing to the rest of the heads of state, and the post Second World War world economic order was featured by an American dominance. Bretton Woods also established, apart from the institutions, some key mechanisms to mold the world economy. These mechanisms can be divided in three: the currency stability, the credit and financing institutions, and a fear of international trade and investment. When analyzing the currency stability suggested by the Allied powers, we can see that the main goal was to stabilize the expansion of international trade, and in order to achieve that, they decided to base it on the dollar exchange standard, also known as adjustable peg system, due to its dominance in terms of productivity and outputs. Therefore, the dollar was accepted not only as a stable store of value, but also as an international medium of exchange. So as to create a new economic order, the necessity to create credit and financing institutions emerged. Therefore, the Bretton Woods created two bodies, the already mentioned International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The IMF was created to promote an international monetary cooperation, facilitating the expansion of international trade. Its aim was to help countries finance short-term deficit. The World Bank, on the other hand, was originally set to help reconstruct and develop weaker states. It basically provided a source for the financing of the Third World. The last tools created by Bretton Woods to impose the liberalization were the GATT and the World Trade Organization. The first one was formed in 1948 to establish an international trade organization to ensure free trade with imposition of penalties for non-conforming countries. In the 1990s, the World Trade Organization was created, and ever since its formation, it has been regarded as the official institution of neoliberalism. However, the stability that provided the US leadership started to break down in the late 1960s and in early 1980s due to the challenging of European economies in market power and the decline of US capacity to underwrite the global monetary order. Therefore, the US decided to devalue its currency by 10% in the 1971, and 2 years later, the American country took the unilateral decision to suspend the dollar gold convertibility. When analyzing the role of these institutions, there is the important need to focus on functions that they carried out in the Third World, which is characterized by the theory introduced by Lenin, which says that uneven development created by the unequal exchange and exploitation is the primary structural reason for the failure of trade to benefit the Third World due to its terrible terms. Consequently, the Third World countries never had an easy relationship with Bretton Woods, since its institutions had the reputation of being US dominated and being elitist and conservative. For this same reason, between the 60s and the 70s, the Third World countries pushed their own development agenda through UN economic institutions, which were controlled by their own economies. The reason Well, do you remember the one vote, one member system of the GA, the General Assembly? Thanks to this system of voting, third world countries were numerically stronger and they achieved some of their goals, such as the creation of some institutions to help grow their economies. The Special UN Fund for Economic Development, the International Development Association, or the formation of a UN Conference on Trade and Development, amongst others. Also, they created third world dominated organizations such as the Non Aligned Movement, the Group of 77, and the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Obviously, all of these third world victories represented an undermining of US hegemony too, to which we can add the development of European countries that we mentioned before, as a main reason for the breakdown of the American currency stability. In fact, due to this collapse of the dollar exchange in 1970s, the IMF and the World Bank were regarded as useless. That's why, from that moment on, the IMF and the World Bank shifted their functions towards the Third World, which basically tried to implement the Washington Consensus programs. Hence, in the 1980s, they started to introduce structural adjustments to remove the obstacles which prevented free trade. Well, this explanatory video is coming to an end, but before saying goodbye, it's necessary to say that ever since the global financial crisis started, many critics towards neoliberalism and the Washington Consensus have emerged, especially from leftist parties. And due to these critics, the institutions have experienced some reformation. For example, the G20 has replaced the GA, which means that 12 more countries have theoretically become more important in the international sphere. The World Trade Organization, which has been criticized for creating unfair competition in developing countries and therefore promoting inequalities and neoliberal consolidation, it now gives considerable influence to its individual weaker member states. In fact, World Trade Organization is committed to multilateralism, which means that it's really more independent than people think. And last but certainly not least, there has been a remarkable softening of the former pro market economy ideology and the policies implemented by the IMF. To sum up, these are the main creations which caused a shift in the international economic sphere and created the economic system in which we are living nowadays.